much for joining yet again a Friday afternoon for the Women and Contemporary Italian Theory speaker series. And I'm Ren, as you know, and together with Teresa, and Arts and Science postdoc at the Department of Italian Studies and a distinguished graduate from Complete. We're excited and honored to have you here today. And as some of you know, this year's theme for the series is forms of power and potentiality. So power has always shaped how we relate to each other and form our identities. And in this series, we would like to explore how oppressive power operates today across the globe and consider ways to live with each other beyond the capitalist imperative and its forms of oppression. And more specifically, today's panel is titled Sexual Difference in Feminist Refusal. As Alicia Riccardi remarks in Finding Ferrante, Authorship and the Politics of World Literature, Italian school of feminism originates with, quote, thinking of difference, which is less interested in securing legal rights than in finding forms of creative freedom through social practices. And in North America today, where liberalism has apparently failed to secure rights for women, BIPOC, and queer populations, how shall we rethink the question of rights for women and the question of difference? And moreover, what might refusal, revolt, and creativity look like in today's world? These are some of the questions we'd like to explore in today's panel. And lastly, we'd like to thank both of our departments, Italian Studies and the Center for Comparative Literature, for your generous support for this initiative. The series offers opportunity to highlight not only Italian women philosophers, but also scholars who engage with and expand upon contemporary Italian theory in their work. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Teresa to introduce our speaker.
Thank you everyone for coming as well. And many of you know already Ben Koonar. Ben Koonar is a PhD candidate at the Center for Complet at the University of Toronto. His dissertation titled AIDS, Portraits and Other Impossibility is a study of literary portraits of people in France and the United States. He's a co-translator with Thomas Ayou of Herve Gilbert's novella, The Dogs. Let's give him a first round of applause.
Okay, thanks, Teresa and Ran. Hello, everyone. Oh, so should I put this on? Yeah. So the title of my paper is Anything Still Revolutionary About Gay Male Subjectivity? In his 1995 book, Homos, Leo Bersani states, inherent in gay desire is a revolutionary inaptitude for heteroized sociality. Somewhere within the desire of one man for another, their lack of suitability or skill for sociality as it is known. And this inaptitude could drive a redefinition of the basis of social relations. He made this claim 14 years after the first cases of rare cancers were detected in homosexuals in California, a discovery that unleashed an unprecedented wave of homophobia and ushered an era of mass death that would not let up until 1996 in the Global North, the year after Homos was published. At the time, social construction was dominating the emerging field of queer theory. In both Homos and in its prequel, the 1987 essay, Is the Rectum a Grave?, Bersani argues that theories emphasizing the nature of homosexuality are making a strategic mistake. Obfuscating the specificity of homosexuality claiming that it is a subversion of gender norms, or a consciousness of structural oppression, or a resistance to regimes of the normal, is, in his view, a concession. It conveys embarrassment over the thing that, in flesh and blood, actually makes a gay man who and he is, and that should serve as the basis for any adequate response to homophobia. In contrast to social constructivist theories that diminish the importance of sex in the definition of homosexuality, legs high in the air, unable to refuse the suicidal ecstasy of being a woman. The gay male subject is a man who uses his rectum to indulge in the self-destructive pleasures of receptive female sexuality. The gay man's inaptitude concerns the masculine ideal. He is not good at meeting the expectations assigned to him at birth, and nowhere is this more obvious than when he is having sex. In the third volume of The History of Sexuality, Foucault argues that homosexuality came into being in the 19th century. Before that, it was, of course, possible to engage in homosexual acts, but it was inconceivable to use these acts to define one's identity. Homosexuality is therefore a relatively recent phenomenon, but its worth, its value, is based on a much older set of beliefs. In Athens, during the 5th century BCE, it was socially acceptable for free, landowning men to have sex with other men, provided they maintained the active role. To bottom was considered to be an abdication of the self-relation necessary to govern. In other words, to bottom was to give up power. For Bersani, phallocentrism is not principally defined as an obsession with the penis, nor as a hatred of the female genitals, but rather as the attempt to deny the appeal of powerlessness. Powerlessness, he says, is exactly that, not primarily the denial of power to women, although it has obviously led to that everywhere and at all times, but above all the denial of the value of powerlessness in both men and women. I do not mean the value of gentleness, non-aggressiveness, or even passivity, but rather of a radical disintegration and humiliation of the self. Receptive sex continues to be demeaning because of the persistence of phallocentrism, which mandates that an individual can keep a hold of themselves during sex. They can and should stay in control, dominant, and on top, and should not experience even the appeal of powerlessness, much less give in to it. The gay man, as a man, is well equipped for this task, but his desire for other men makes him inept. If this ineptitude is to be what it is, it cannot simply be a guise for an aptitude, as though it were a weakness that is really a strength. And yet that is what the adjective revolutionary would seem to imply. When Bersani writes of a potentially revolutionary inaptitude, perhaps inherent in gay desire for sociality as it is known, it sounds like this inaptitude is a point of departure. It is the key to breaking with the sociality of the present and to launching a new way of relating to both ourselves and others. And I do think that this is what Bersani meant. He envisioned the gay male inaptitude as the possible beginning of a new kind of relation, one that acknowledges, rather than denies, the appeal of powerlessness in men, women, and everybody else. Guillaume illustrates this possibility when he writes, "The fusion of two beings into one is not so easily achieved by means other than by face-to-face penetration. which allows them to look at each other, possibly even talk to each other, and to kiss at the same time while taking each other. The gay man in Bersani's picture is in missionary position. His legs are high in the air, and the viewer is situated between them in the role of the top. The man is inviting us to get a whole lot closer, to look at him, maybe say a few words, and to kiss him, until the self disintegrates, and it is impossible to say who is who. The grown man's soliciting position raises the possibility that would not conclude in a securely defined self. This relation would be, or so Bersani hoped, less jealous, less possessive, and less invasive than those currently practiced. The problem, however, or one problem, is that this relation can only come about if the gay man's inaptitude remains if it is converted into a strength, its value becomes tied to its power, its secret power, and the appeal of powerlessness is foreclosed. In his latest actual Political, Lorenzo Bernini identifies a problem inherent to a revolutionary inaptitude. His book deals with the exclusion of the sexual from the political and the sexual implications of the political bond that is brought about through this exclusion. So the sexual and the political for Bernini are incompatible. It is impossible for a sexual inaptitude to provide the grounds for a political program or movement, because the sexual itself is inherently apolitical. For a queer liberation movement, then, a revolutionary sexual inaptitude is a strange mixture of hope and frustration. Bernini draws his definition of the sexual from Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. In the essays, Freud outlines the standard, healthy resolution of the Oedipal complex, the process that leads to genital-focused heterosexual adults. Alongside this main argument, however, Freud struggles to define the sexual. So this is Bernini. I will call the enigma that Freud claims to have failed to solve the sexual. That which escapes rational understanding in sexuality challenges the productive and reproductive logic of means and ends, and therefore both utilitarian and evolutionist theories. The wild and phantasmatic element of sexuality, which explodes the illusory unity of our subjectivity, shatters our fantasies of self-control, and retracts us from a destiny as mere bearers of the life of the species. I will not attempt to define it, since not even the great Freud could. Drive, however, is a synonym for it, and infantile is the adjective that originally connotes it. So the sexual is an enigma within sexuality that cannot be understood. It is not tied to reproduction, nor self-preservation, nor pleasure. It has no identifiable use or end. It generates excitation for excitation's sake, causing the subject to swell and to shatter. It is drive within human beings that makes it impossible to know ourselves, and that would precede any resolution or any resolution of the Oedipal complex. Bernini defines the political as a bond that forms once the sexual is excluded. So he said in a previous quote, the political bond is brought about through the exclusion of the sexual. However, the sexual here does not simply go away. For Bernini, the sexual is intractable, and no revolutionary struggle, no corrective education can change that. Once excluded, the sexual returns, appearing to the members of the political community in the guise of a threatening figure. This figure is then targeted, rounded up, or left for dead. One of Bernini's main points in the book is that this is a problem not only for liberal democracies. Liberation movements of the 70s and 80s that he surveys in his book, he diagnoses a persistent inability to accommodate the sexual, precisely because the sexual cannot be accommodated. It inhibits the formation of coalitions, the organization of masses, the seizure of power. Bernini cites the rhetoric of sex and body positivity in contemporary queer culture as a concerning trend, because it suggests that queer people themselves are, or are increasingly, believing that sin, and in fact should, be an edifying part of one's life, that it can and should be an expression of love and goodwill towards oneself and others. Sexuality is taking place at the same time as queer rights and protections invoke to legitimate violence against migrants and Palestinians. The sexual, the radical disintegration and of the self, never goes away. The choice would be to acknowledge it in oneself or displace it onto others. In an interview with The Telegraph, filmed in March 24, somewhere in Ontario's cottage country, Jordan Peterson diagnoses Justin Trudeau with a dark tetrad personality type, a blend of sadistic and narcissistic traits, which, Peterson says, is especially common in effeminate men. So I've tried to suggest that if there's anything still revolutionary about gay male subjectivity, it may be the inaptitude for heteroized sociality Bersani identified in 1995. It may be the best of the inadequate weapons available to gay men, this new wave of homophobia, without just throwing somebody else under the bus. Thanks.
Are you okay if you like the questions all at the end?
Yeah.
Okay. Our next speaker is Deng. Is a doctoral candidate at the Center for Literature at the University of Toronto. She's also affiliated with the Women and Gender Studies Institute and the Center for Sexual Diversity Studies. Her dissertation project, titled Beyond Biopolitics of Consent, a Trans-Pacific Reproductive Futurity, investigates the politics of consent in redressing reproductive injustice across the Pacific. Her research interests include trans-Pacific critique, political philosophy, and queer aesthetic theory. Let's welcome
Thank you everyone for coming. So my presentation is titled Body Against Body, Rethinking Maternal Subjectivity. So this is part of the second chapter of my dissertation where I talk about how the specific construction of China's population control policies has created a politics of childbirth, maternal relation, women's reproductive capacity, and population growth. So in this presentation specifically, I want to engage with Salvia Federici's most recent work to think about the role of the body in these social and historical articulations. So I'm interested in how the so-called female body is both narrated and sometimes expelled from the discursive construction of maternal subjectivity. So thinking along Ricci's 2020 monograph, Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, Rethinking, Remaking, and Reclaiming the Body in Contemporary Capitalism, I consider the body as a site where the corporeal, the discursive, the psychological, and the technological intersect. So furthermore, I try to deconstruct the Marxist feminist critique of the capitalist exploitation, which reduces the body to a unit of work. Therefore, the female body as emblematic of unpaid reproductive labor. So I'm curious about how this view is established upon a creation of difference, be it difference between differently classed, gendered, and sexualized bodies, but also a difference between the maternal body and the child or fetus. So in other words, I want to think about how these bodies are distinguished and placed against each other at times for this label critique to make sense. Building on and response to Federici's work, I want to argue that the so-called female maternal body is in fact very malleable and diverse, and that women's reproductive capacity is not always needed or wanted both socially and historically. And lastly, inspired by Federici's last chapter on dance, which is a point I'm trying to make in my dissertation, I'd like to think about the spatial capacity of the maternal body. So to think about a maternal space instead of a maternal subjectivity. Presentation. My presentation is a bit long, so I might run out of time. So if I see you being really bored, I might just skip a part. So before I start, for those of you who would appreciate a content wing, I don't know, consider yourself warned. There's a lot of stuff in here. So I tried to make it a little more interesting for a Friday afternoon. So I'll incorporate different examples. So this basically shows we're screwed. But to be more exact, so what we're seeing here is the recent co-option of the My Body, My Choice campaign. Which originated in the 60s in support of women's right to abortion. So the original slogan on the left, we see that the female body is being recognized as a site of struggle, while women's lack of reproductive position is highlighted as a lack of control over one's body. In the middle, we see that during the pandemic, the slogan was co-opted by vaccine opponents, that's what the image is for, to express their disagreement with the government's mask and vaccination mandates. So this co-option makes the liberal claim that one's body belongs only to oneself. However, different from the original slogan's response to the restrictions and regulations placed against the women's body, this anti-vax version serves to disregard the body's impact on others and the environment, thus obscuring the unvaccinated body's potential health risk and consequences on others. And furthermore, on the far right, so politically speaking, we see another version of the slogan, and this time twisted after the 2024 re-election. So young men in America marched with signs saying, "Your body, my choice," in celebration of Trump's presidency. And conservatives across social media shared and celebrated this regression. Although the popularity of the slogan on social media is partially due to its provocative nature as a rage bait designed to generate views and reactions from the audience, it also reflects a chilling trend that women's bodies are increasingly being subsumed by the men's rights movement, which views women as property. So, as you're seeing here, so anti-contraception conservative women on social media who self-identify as so traditional housewives have also joined in. Photos of their pregnant bodies on social media with the caption, "My body, his choice," highlighting the fertility of the female body and its fitness to impregnation. So this, along with the anti-vax option of the original slogan, underscores the question whose body and whose choice have becoming pressing in our contemporary moment. And this, for me, raises the question, has the use of the body in feminist refusal lost its efficacy? And if so, how has the female reproductive body come to be viewed merely as property, whether one's own or someone else's, circulating not only economically but also politically between the two opposing sides of the political spectrum? So this is my agenda for today after the introduction. But first, talk a little bit about what I'm doing in my dissertation. So the trans-Pacific co-articulation of the female body and maternal subjectivity in this specific context. So chapter, I'm looking at China. And here, Federici is really helpful in pointing out some of the contradictions embedded in the construction of female subjectivity. And then I will examine her writing on the instrumentality of the gendered body as a disciplined laboring body under capitalism. And at this point, I diverge from her emphasizing reproductive labor as unpaid work, specifically assigned to biological women. I would like to consider what remains at stake when we attempt to reclaim maternal subjectivity, particularly given women's historical subjugation throughout the long process of capitalist accumulation. And finally, I would like to expand on this idea of dance that Federici leaves sort of underexplored at the end of the skein in her final chapter titled In Praise of the Dancing Body. So I'm going to begin with a case study, my dissertation. So again, consider yourself warned. So on December 12th, this Chinese newspaper, Southern Weekly, 南方周末, published an in-depth article on the suicide of Bao Li, an undergraduate student at Peking University. According to the article, Bao had been emotionally manipulated and abused by her then boyfriend, Mu Linghan, a fellow student at the same university. During an interview, press, Bao's mother disclosed parts of Bao and Mu's online chat history, revealing startling conversations between the two that had since sparked public outcry. Mu was apparently, so the guy was apparently unhappy after Bao confessed to him that she had had a sexual relationship with her ex-boyfriend, meaning she was no longer a virgin when she met him. Claiming that he could not move past such a breach of trust, Mu became abusive towards Bao. Later, upon learning of Bao's wish to end the relationship, the boyfriend wrote that he would only agree to it either let him impregnate her and followed it with an abortion, or if she underwent sterilization surgery and give him her fallopian tubes as proof. And Bao decided to take her own life. So this chat history suggests that the rationale behind Mu's outrageous demand lies in his conviction that Bao would become undone as a woman after either procedure. Within the context of China's birth and population control policy, which is a nationwide measure that has been legally disavowing certain reproductive possibilities through techno-scientific methods since the 1970s, the tragic story of Bao also suggests a lapse of logic in the state-sanctioned reduction of femininity to women's reproductive function. So in this definition, femininity is imbued with a number of meanings. Right? So first, Mu's anachronistic demand for Bao's virginity reflects his belief in pristine girlhood, which would require Bao to maintain sexual untendedness by guarding herself against unauthorized male penetration. And it was through the imagination of the stage of girlhood that Mu saw himself in a reproductive future, that he must be the one taking Bao's virginity and thus guiding her towards womanhood through his penetration or impregnation. Bao's having already had sexual experience made him an access in her essential transformation into womanhood. As he lamented Bao's loss of sexual untendedness, sexual coercion took the form of antinatalism, barring Bao from potential motherhood, perhaps to compensate for his inability to return her body to this sort of pristine condition, and subsequently leading to her suicide. So a second principle underlying this definition of femininity is thus conditioned by its positive association with reproductive futurism. As Mu's incredulous proposals demonstrate, both abortion and sterilization would diminish a woman's use value, a view aligned with Chinese government pro-natalist discourse since the official end of the one-child policy in 2016. Thus, femininity is conceived as both girlish and motherly. It refers to an embodied plasticity required of the reproductive body to oscillate between opening up and remaining closed off in accordance with nationalist patriarchal demands. So this conception of femininity undermines the validity of reproductive consent in significant ways. The tragedy of Bao is emblematic of a political desire to portray femininity as both agentially and corporeally unstable. It suggests that a woman, embodied by the innocence of girlhood, must first be viewed as a self-contained, autonomous subject prior to any sexual engagement, making her solely responsible for fending off any unwarranted contact and for preserving sexual reproductive untendedness. So in essence, she is sexless, both in terms of gender and of desire. However, it's also expected under the appropriate circumstances to willingly objectify herself and making herself available as a vessel for childbirth, one that contains the essential necessary for procreation. And therefore, this construction of female subjectivity is embodied by the competing coexistence of two disparate figures, one sexist and independent, and the other maternal and codependent, and neither of whom is capable of deciding the course of her life. So I turn to Federici, and in this book, she is very well aware of this inconsistency. So in Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, Federici visits her writing in Caliban and the Witch, where she argued that while the development of capitalism has encapsulated the human body, this process has differed for men and women, since women were subject to different forms of coerced labor. Through the persecution of witches, women who wished to make reproductive decisions were demonized and denounced as enemies of the state. And this has continued to the present day by the persecution in the name of baby killers in anti-abortion discourses. And in addition, and this is important, Fed also points out that the inability of the feminist movement to fight to guarantee that no woman should be denied the right to have children because of the material condition of her life and the feminist representation of abortion as a choice have created divisions between white and black women and that we must not reproduce. So what she means here is that certain class and region had historically been denied motherhood, while those who were deemed worthy of having offspring were coerced into childbirth. So if we see the right to abortion as an active form of refusal of enter the capitalist economy of biological reproduction, then we must also recognize that there are many bodies that have been subject to techno-scientific manipulation that altered their reproductive capacity. So in China's case, the right to abortion has been figured from a nationalist against overpopulation. However, after the decline of birth rate became seen as a crisis in the 2010s, this policy betrayed itself to accuse women for not giving the nationalist patriarchal state. So starting on January 1st, 2016, all married couples in China are allowed to have 2 children, and now it's, I believe. This marked the end of the one-child policy, which was established in 1979. So some of the official rationales behind ending this policy, including the growing gender imbalance and the fear, and this I found so fascinating, that single men would grow old like the bachelors will age without women to take care of them because of their imbalance. So the government really relies on this heteronormative discourse of family structure of the nuclear family to rationalize its demand for gender equality in this like very numeric sense. So the previously unwanted female fetuses, so because of the one-child policy, there were many infanticides against girl infants and abortions of girl fetuses, right? So these unwanted feminine bodies are now refigured and held dear as potential vessels to produce care, bring social unity, as well as reproducing themselves in order to absorb the impact of the gender excess created by the policy is 35 years. So the biologically excess female body is now taken upon as a tool to recalibrate the surplus gender, age group, as well as native lifestyles. So in addition, the formation of the birth and population control policies in China has also been very transnational and complex. You might not be able to see this, but I will explain. So the United Nations Population Fund, and it used to be titled the United Nations Fund for Population Activities, and now it's been changed. So this is also very interesting on their part. So it began to operate in China in the late 60s, introducing the scientific discipline of demographic studies. So with the latent mission to curb population growth in third world countries, the UNFPA facilitated an understanding of national identity as data-driven and intergenerational, while China's own history with imperial succession coheres with this concentration on offspring and reproductive futurism. So together, this trans-Pacific collaboration between the Chinese Communist Party and the UNFPA worked to develop a modernized notion of maternal subjectivity, interweaving imperial histories, socialist feminist ideals, global humanitarian missions, and colonial ambitions. Yet at the center of this national identity was the definition of the female body, one that aligned with and sustained the politically oscillating the political oscillation between pro and antinatalism through its reproductive potential. So turning to Federici, she writes in response to Judith Butler's theory of gender performativity, just how performativity is being used in feminist studies in general. And she says, quote, "We cannot reclaim our bodies without changing the material conditions of," end quote. So here she emphasizes that our bodies are shaped by the social and historical conditions of our lives, and above all, structural inequalities produced by colonial relations. So in writing about surrogacy in the so-called developing countries, Federici writes, and there's a quote here, "We should be concerned that division and specialization of mothering into gestational, social, biological represents a devaluation of this process. Once considered a power of women and the restoration of a sexist, patriarchal, truly Aristotelian concept of women's bodies and women themselves, who are portrayed in the rhetoric of surrogacy, passive carriers of a life to which they contribute nothing of their own except for brute matter." Sorry, there's a typo. So while Federici has insightfully here identifies the technocratic logic implied in the process of surrogacy and its false separation between the maternal body and its reproductive capacity, this view of like seeing the reproductive body merely as machine under capitalism, this is where I diverge from her theorization in that to think of reproductive capacity as a value or gift specifically assigned to the female body might undermine both the hegemonic power of who and what's outside the female body, as well as the potential sharing of the so-called reproductive labor. So according to Federici, the body, because, quote, "rethinking how capitalism has transformed our body into labor power helps us place in a context the crisis our bodies are currently undergoing, and at the same time read behind our and individual pathologies, the search for new anthropological paradigms," end quote. However, focusing on work and labor power as the primary source of accumulation in this analysis falls into the same pitfall as the socialist feminists in China in the 60s and 70s, where women's struggle became secondary to that struggle. So here I feel like China is a good case to illustrate how this alleged radical sameness history of Chinese communism, right? So this kind of sameness between men and women, the radical like gender neutrality across communist history. But it allowed women to enter the workforce at the expense of their reproductive, but it is at the expense of their reproductive freedom, and with an underdeveloped feminist consciousness. But it also failed to acknowledge the presence of reproductive labor or capacity beyond the female body. So another aspect I struggled with while reading Federici is her critique performance theory. So I'll give you a minute to read this. I'm gonna have some water. Oh yeah. Yeah. Says maternity is not a destiny, but it is also not something to be programmatically avoided as if it were the cause of women's misery and exploitation. No more than possessing or a breast is the capacity to give birth a curse. When from a medical profession, in parenthesis, that has sterilized us, lobotomized us, ridiculed us when we came giving birth, must liberate us. Nor maternity a gender performing act. Rather, it should be understood as a political value positing. In a self-governing, autonomous society, such decisions would be taken in consideration of our collective well-being, the available resources, and the preservation of the natural wealth. Today as well, such considerations cannot be ignored, but the decision to have a child must also be seen as a refusal to allow capital's planners to decide who is allowed to live and who instead must die or cannot even be born. So here, Federici proposes to see, so instead of performance theory, Federici proposes to see non-articulations of gender and sexuality as a result of, quote, people seeking alternatives to a life regulated by work and the market, end quote. And because, I'm quoting, and because work can no longer be a source of identity formation, and because they wish to be more creative, the workers. So those disenchanted with accumulation seek freedom by, quote, questioning sexual division of labor and with the queer rejection of gender. So as Corey Knudsen writes in the review, the scheme calls for a rearticulation of what its author construes as formally stable boundaries around the female gender and the female body in general. And so here I want to add perhaps this is a result of this focus on labor and seeing maternity as value positing. So if we continue to insist on a subject-oriented critique of gender and maternity in order to weaken the figure of the father and patriarchy, right, such as implied in the slogan of my body, my choice, we continue to rely on the binary conception of biological gender, highlights the irreplaceability of maternal labor. So this reliance on sexual difference, not to suggest that it doesn't exist, demands that biological distinctions align with identitarian ones for each sex or gender, thereby assigning the labor of childbirth, child rearing specifically to the mother. Sorry, I'm almost done. So in my dissertation, I think more about this question of sexual difference, and then I also engage with a series of installation art projects. We can talk more about this during the Q&A because of time. So here I'll just lay out a bit of my theoretical inspiration. So in Theory of Sexual Relation, Jean-Luc Nancy unpacks Jacques Lacan's famous assertion, quote, there is no such thing as a sexual relation, saying that sex and are one and the same. So for Nancy, what signifies being is the drive to differ from oneself, and in doing so, to encounter the other within oneself. So if sexuation forges a relationship between self and other, it must a priori facilitate the separation or individuation of being. So in other words, sex creates by the very act of fracturing the presence of its subjects. hence Lacan's rejection of the possibility of both sexual rapport and jouissance. However, Nancy diverges from Lacan by arguing that there can be a sexual relation so far as the there is denotes a process of constant becoming, so what he calls spacing, that neither fully constitutes a relation nor culminates in a separation. So in this way, the Iliad, there is of sexual relation, resonates with Derrida's concept of chora, which designates a place between the existence and being, which Derrida characterizes as maternal. So one significance of thinking in terms of maternal space instead of maternal subjectivity lies in its lack of a destination. So I think here, I see sort of a convergence between our talks as well. So chora has no ends, and neither leads to the production of subjectivity nor recognizes the reproductive body for its maternal labor. In other words, this way of thinking pushes back on scholarship that seeks to redeem feminine value through women's reproductive capacity. Moreover, to think in terms of maternal space is to avoid privileging the fetus child and or the reproductive body or the mother over one another. So the maternal space, that absence is the sole communal property between the sexual body and the one to be born. It is through the process of subjectivation, of insisting that there is a subjective relation, that the maternal absence, what Derrida calls a spaceless space, becomes invested with social and political significance. So the cultural signification of childbirth is then manifested through positive logic of rights and possession, such as we see in pro-life advocates' insistence on the fetus's right to be born because life belongs to God, right? Or the pro-choice side's claim on women's right to remain childless because a woman's body belongs to. So again, my body, my choice. So recognizing that the maternal space is itself, quote, not the subject or the present support of all these interpretations, end quote, we might sense that birth is not and can never become a consensual event, for birth is held by the maternal space in such a way that does not fulfill the latter's. So to close, since I'm aware of time, I want to draw attention to the very end of Federici's book, which I find very capacious, where she proposes this preliminary idea of dance, which I supplemented with a quote from Agamben's Carmen. So I just want to sort of leave that with you as another way to think about difference, the body, and maternal space. Thank you.
I guess we can open up the discussion, and do you want to lead the Q&A?
Would you like to?
Okay. Do you have questions?
So much for the talk. Really good. So we'd love to know more about the artwork. So can you tell us more? Can you tell us more about the artwork in your presentation? The one with the metrics?
Yeah.
Yeah. I know you would love to talk about that.
I'm glad
About that too. Yeah. Like in what way does that like your thinking around reproductivity, like how that figure in the artwork or how it illuminate that?
Yeah, so I having flashbacks of my qualifying exam. This was part of that. This is art by a Chinese American artist, Deng, which I engage with extensively in this chapter. So this one specifically is called The Anatomy of the Printing Matrix. So essentially what she does here is she took historical drawings of the uterus. So like these are not accurate scientific reproductions of what is actually there, but just like some Frenchman's drawing of it. And then she reproduces them. She put them on, so she's a printmaking artist. She uses lithography. So she put on litho plates, but instead of actually making the print, you're seeing here is the so these are prints of the plate with the content of the what's inside the uterus. So like in the original drawings, they're like first of the fetus carved out. So in this sense, she's talking about this kind of space as this empty sort of absence. But also, she, as an artist, her political stance is she's very firm and just, meaning that she believes that anyone having a child is unethical and that should not be allowed. So it's a very dystopian belief. So I think Jack is about anger because a lot of people were angry at her show. So she's like talking about how to process this kind of rage towards herself. I think that really sort of like ties into what I was to argue about sort of this absence of subjectivity, but also leaving space to imagine what can be possible beyond this sort of reproductive tourism that we more commonly encounter. Yeah, thank you for your question.
Can I follow up a little bit on that? Thank you for your explanation because I think like for me, I'm intrigued by your interest in the idea of Cora, right? That you talk about it toward the end. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there's a relation between the idea of metric and Cora, right? So because metric here is the part of printing press that's like the origin of thing that they put in. And I think like metric also the Plato also used when he talks about Cora, right? And that's kind of like leads up to Christy Weil. So think about the Cora as the maternal. I think it's really interesting. Like, and I think like maybe we can think further like Cora in relation to dance. How would that look like? But I mean, I'm inspired by your talk to think more about that. Thank you so much.
I'm currently writing this chapter, so that's very helpful. Is there a question for Ben?
Thanks very much for your question, for your talks. I really enjoyed them. You know, it seems that in both speakers there was an emphasis on some form of relationality that tends to be structured largely socially, culturally, politically, and so on. But I'm wondering whether in both talks we can mind of those who are actually relating to one another and look at some psychic structures. So in particular, the role of pleasure and the role of willing somehow or assenting or not assenting. So the idea of this kind of the intimacy of the relationship outside of the social structures that condition it. And I'm wondering what role something like the life of psyche, libidinal pleasure, libidinal, the schizoid nature of psyche, to follow Deleuze's kind of talk. What role does that play in the kind of establishing of the different kind of relationalities that you're seeking politically? Yeah, thank you.
Well, sort of the sort of quasi-utopian relation that I was thinking about kind of in Bersani's wake would be one that acknowledges powerlessness. Now, the extent to which we can will that, I think, is like a question. Like, this is such a sort of heavy concept, the kind of disintegration of the self, the disintegration of the psychic structures of the body, that it's hard to really know what we can do about it. It seems clear from the sort of phallocentric model that it's possible to deny its existence, right, in oneself, see it projected other places. So that suggests that it's possible to acknowledge it in oneself. Yeah, but I do think, I mean, there's a book, I'm sure probably many of you know it, Policing Desire by Simon Watney, that he wrote in 1985, it came out in 86, and it was the first comprehensive study, psychoanalytically informed study of representations of people with AIDS on the news, where he really says the origin of all of the representations, like, is this deeply complex relation that people have to their body's capacity for intense pleasure. Like, that's a tricky thing for everyone to live with. And I think that's very commensurate. It's sort of, it is what Bersani says as well. Talks about the appeal of powerlessness, how terrifying that is, actually, that we want to give in to these very self-destructive, impulses. So beyond acknowledging it, I don't know really what we can do in terms of will, living with it.
Thank you for the question. I think maybe I can just start from this sort of acknowledgement. And so how I'm thinking about this question is sort of like there's a difference between knowledge and acknowledgement that I'm really trying to parse. So like my entire dissertation project is about this question of consent. So, for example, I guess in Federici's chapter on surrogacy, she talks about how the surrogate mother sometimes, after having carried a child, wants to keep the child, and how like this becomes this ethical dilemma. So, like in the U.S., there are lawsuits about this. So it's interesting to think about like how we give consent in this context of how you go into this process, right? It's completely capitalist. It's seeing body as machine. Is to say like I consent to this process of carrying someone else's child, and I have no relation to this child, right? To think of relationality in this like very strictly capitalistic these terms, but. I think what interests me here is that for us to consent to one another, to consent to an event or something even less than an event, there's this assumption that we have the knowledge of ourselves, but also of the future. We have to make this prediction after 9 months of carrying a baby. I won't feel attached. So I think this is maybe like the other intimacy that I'm trying to think through is that I think this question of consent often is predicated upon an intent that cannot change. So, precisely the sort of relationality with one another that pretends to be structured. So, trying to think about temporality and think about acknowledgement instead of knowledge to sort of to think about powerlessness, to give into this risk of not knowing the future, of not knowing fully what I desire and what the other person desires, and to trust us a little bit.
Yeah, and just to add, just one of the interesting things about Bersani's use of the word inaptitude, a sort of inaptitude for power, it's very non-heroic. It's not like it's giving in, willingly. It's a matter of skill, of sort of inability, and for one reason or another, it's happening. Right? Yeah.
Since you mentioned aptitude, I actually have a question about it. Two questions, actually. So when you were working on this concept of inaptitude and powerlessness in Leo Bersani, have you also thought of connection with Vatos weak theory and how he's using weakness as a concept to undermine master narratives in general, not applying it to gender specifically. But how he says that this weakening is actually can happen only if it's weak.
Right.
So it cannot just be another paradigm of embracing weakness.
Yeah.
And that would make it a strong narrative again. So if I don't know, stumbled into connection among the two. And then I was actually curious about why Leo Bersani decided to spell inaptitude with an A instead of with an E, and if it's because, at least in Italian literature, there's and probably also maybe North American English literature, there's a huge, a very long tradition of inaptitude connotated in a negative way. And if it was if Leo Bersani used inaptitude with an A instead of an E to take a step back from that kind of tradition who was interpreting inaptitude only in a negative way. I don't know.
Yeah, I did look up the difference to try to wrap my head around, because he uses both times. He uses revolutionary inaptitude twice in the book, and both times it's inaptitude with the A. Yeah, and I did look at the definition to try to wrap my head around it. It's interesting. Inaptitude, quite literally, is a lack of skill at something, and to be inept is to be it's more tied with incompetence.
Yeah.
Right. It's very close to one another.
But I don't know, not being a native English speaker, I feel though that with the E is a term we go to more often, or correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So that's why I'm thinking.
Yeah. So it seems pointed. You mean that he used the A?
Yeah, I think it's maybe it could
Right.
be actually
Yeah.
a willful choice to.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and it sounds like that's something to think about for me. Yeah, but just on the point about was it weakness? Yeah, I think that point about the weakness having weak is crucial. It sounds like that would be a really similar concept, the way Brownie's thinking about inaptitude. He distinguishes it in that phallocentrism passage from gentleness, aggressiveness from passivity. I think he would also distinguish it from the way vulnerability gets used a lot these days, where vulnerability becomes your power, exposing your vulnerability, like the talk from the last session. Yeah, I think he would really challenge that. Yeah, it's very... unworkable, this weakness that remains a weakness, or inaptitude that remains an inaptitude. Thanks. Yeah, I'll think more about the inapt, the E versus A.
Yeah, I was just saying with the A, you're also talking of with the A in the attitude, it's also a question of the lack of fit.
Mm.
It's not just inept, it's
Mm.
inapt. You know, it's that there's inability to connect there. So that's I think a meaning that enriches what you're saying about it.
Thanks.
Other questions?
Yeah, I guess just to pick up on that a minute, so that those two words that make up that phrase, right, revolutionary inaptitude, is nicely paired as you directed our attention to that other kind of non-contradicting pair of words that makes up the phrase suicidal ecstasy, right? So there's a way in which, in both cases, Bruce is pointing to this irresolvable tension that you're calling our attention to, right? Which is this sort of non-canceling out of the, where ecstasy holds the place of revolutionary, and inaptitude holds the place of the suicidal, and there's a way in which, he's suggesting literally hold those two terms together, and in that lies something that is not going to devolve into either one of the other two terms, right? I mean, just pure suicide or pure ecstasy, but there's kind of right. So something about that alignment of very inaptitude. Also, just to suggest that each of the term bears a certain kind of semantic pressure on the other one, right? So there's a way in which the revolutionary gets qualified by being the inapt, and ecstasy gets, and vice versa, right? There's this thing that happens there, which on the face of it looks like an impossible position or stamp, but in fact,
Yeah, and it's my understanding that's why Freud has such a hard time defining the sexual, actually, because of that tension. Because it's people do things that are not. It's not just pleasure; it can involve pleasure, and that's so inexplicable. So it's totally useless.
I have a question for the two of you, if I may. It was such a brilliant pairing of the papers, just have them side by side like that, and to reveal this juxtaposition, which is basically in part a kind of Marx-Freud juxtaposition, and I wonder if even now the two of you could reflect on that in terms of that juxtaposition, the Bersani-Federici juxtaposition, Federici is all of what Bersani saying one should not do: social construction, materiality. But there's a curious way in which they're both reaching to a certain kind of sexual essentialism, we could call it that, right? Through reproduction and through homosexual sex. But the way in which they're deploying that strategic essentialism is really quite different, obviously, and I think you each brought that out. But there may be something there, because I know Bernini's book is on sort of post-Marx, right? It's
Yes.
Freud and...
That's after the colon, it's Freud with Marx, Foucault.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe, I don't know, if you... Yeah.
Do you want to jump in? Or do you want to go? I'm not super familiar with Marx, but I'm always impressed at how far Marxists can get in their programs, actually, and often very good ones, effective ones, like Bernini wrote in some sexual revolutions that were part of the communist movement in Germany in the 20s who were in STI clinics that were providing anonymous, low-cost sexual health to, anyone. Like sort of really impressive institutions. And the sort of, the Freudian inability to define the sexual and the kind of dead end that it goes is so frustrating. By comparison, it just seems like a dead end, really. There's this concept of revolutionary subjectivity that people seem to agree that it's underdefined in Marx, that he mentions it very briefly and doesn't really as far as he could, and then other people have taken it, like Lukács and Badiou and others have taken it up. But one interesting article on that is Ken Kawashima's reading of the late, in a letter I can't remember exactly, but Marx says that we need to prepare ourselves for the exercise of power. There's practices that we need to perform upon ourselves to be able to power on behalf of the proletariat and inaugurate the provisional proletariat dictatorship. And Kawashima reads Foucault's lectures on health as exactly that, as like these sort of cleansing rituals for the exercise of power. But I think there's a question there actually, is if that is in fact what they are doing, or if it's more practices of relinquishing power, of becoming sort of more inept at the exercise of power, cultivating an inaptitude. Sorry, that was a roundabout way.
So thank you for the question. For me, I think a lot of it really is just this question that I have, like, how do I think of the body and materiality sounding like a turf? That's just this kind of, like I really, and I think with like Marxist feminism, it's something I sort of like that I grew up with. It always just feels like there's this idea of the gender binary that I'm trying to wrap around. Like I want to acknowledge, like I think the importance of like the social and historical factors sort of, that are construcive of, how like femininity is viewed in, for instance, China, but also how to sort of move that to think of like others, so in terms of strategy, like how to think beyond the binary to not fall into this idea that women can only be acknowledged by reclaiming their reproductive labor, or on the other side, to give birth as this form of refusal. So I think it's becoming this either or, like to give birth, it's a form of refusal, and to not also. So I think, again, intentionality sort of implied in these decisions. And oftentimes, in reality, so speaking of materiality, it's not the case. Like a lot of women who like their children, who love their children, they have moments of regrets, and people who believe they don't want kids and stand by that decision also have moments of regret. So I'm sort of thinking whether there would be a kind of temporality that's not so linear, to say that one reproductive decision leads to a certain form of life, or leads to even more of life. And this is, I think, maybe to think like psychoanalytically can, because I think I'm also looking at like feminist psychoanalytic theory, where a lot of scholars are trying to link sexual difference of rethink the mother's relation to the child, and to, so like some you mentioned, Christiva, of how instead of the binary in this triangulation, so like still see like there are limitations, I think, in both, of insisting on attaching reproductive women specifically, or to say like, oh, maybe it's not childbirth but it's breastfeeding. Yeah, but I think it's helpful to juxtapose the two. Thank you.
Are there other questions?
One more question to Ben because I want to ask Ben a question. Yeah, it's maybe like a not well thought out question or a little bit shallow question, but we're looking at like how might we contain with the perilous possibility that this kind of like a weak, powerless, co-opted and observed, right?
Yeah.
And being hijacked by those in power.
Yeah.
The product of this leading to a kind of fetishization of powerlessness, right?
Yes.
How would you like respond to that?
Yeah.
Because I listened to your talk, I also think about like people like CNI, right? The idea of cuteness, that like a focus on the powerlessness of the kind of like a.
I think it's a major
Yeah.
problem. Yeah. I mean, I wanted, my first response is that's the work of critique.
Mhm.
It's really that. Yeah, being able to draw distinctions, I feel like is our best bet in dealing with that, which certainly is happening, will continue to happen. I also think the point that came up at the last session about exposing one's vulnerability can be a way of baiting sadistic impulses in people is very real. Showing powerlessness, I mean, showing powerlessness can be a huge, huge strategic error. But yeah, I would just say again, like, even to speak in those terms about showing powerlessness, we've slipped. It's powerless isn't really something that could be like shown or exposed. I don't think, not quite. Yeah.
Are there other questions?
I would be curious to hear more about dance in relation, yeah, in relation to the maternal space.
Yeah. I'm gonna see. So I think again, sort of like what I see having potential here, it's sort of this idea to reinvent the body and also the corporeal boundaries among different bodies of what we think of difference. So I think a sense, I'm also thinking about like vulnerability and precarity and susceptibility of how we could move beyond these limitations of thinking body in space, of how like that could potentially be differently articulated or demarcated, because right, like Ben was talking about like body positivity. So I think there's a lot of in this like liberal articulation of the body, this idea of self-care, of like a self-contained body caring for itself. So like I go to work, I'm very tired, so I take care of myself, I can be a better employee. but how we could think of bodies and our relationship with each other differently. And I think in terms of dance, so here Gamben's theorization of dance is in relation to his theorization of gesture. So how when we think about speech, there are rules, there are very clear articulations of a message, whereas when we think about gesture, it's dependent on, for example, whether the other is receptive to this gesture or recognizes gesture without a fully spelled message in it. So I think he talks about dance in a very similar way. So without ends, without this instrumentality of, say, like speech.
Just keep talking. But just to say that that instrumentality is completely there, Federici's definition, right? That juxtaposition that you're giving us just again couldn't be more stark, right? Hers is all about the potential and the capacity to do and produce, you know, it's right. It's like part and parcel of her whole philosophy, right? And then Agamben's is really quite, so just again, this kind of pronounced difference that we're seeing, you know, is quite telling. I guess that was your intention, right, to put those juxtapositions like that too.
Yeah, so this is actually just like the last paragraph of the book. So it's not really but I thought it was interesting after the critique of performance theory to end on dance. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and it like reminded me of Agamben Carmen. So I just wanted to like put them together to sort of, yeah, yeah.
Difference, right, between them. I mean, I think it's really quite striking.
Right. I think there's still, I guess, sort of this invention and investment that I was talking about earlier. I think when I talked about there, when I talked about Nancy, of how like space is the empty space that it's invented and invested with meaning. So I think either whether it is like a maternal body in general. So I think here there's still this idea of like exploring and inventing of the body to like sort of increase its capacity.
Just a simple question on just the way that I guess both of you would maybe define like a feminist refusal that you see kind of in talks, because here, as John has kind of pointed out, you know, dance and gesture by Agamben is something that is absence of intention. Refusal is obviously this kind of what the revolutionary subject maybe would be more likely to do is to refuse something. But if, you know, playing on the inaptitude, the inept, if gay men show that revolutionary subject is inept, maybe this kind of aesthetic aptitude or something will be what, you know, for lack of a better word, saves them for mere sake of thinking AIDS. But yeah, I just wondered how refusal might, because you both bring it back to the present, right? So I guess in the current, I'm just thinking in the current situation, what you're kind of taking as you kind of drop us there. But yeah, and the notion of refusal is really what I'm asking about.
Do you want to go? Okay, so in picture of the gay man with his legs high in the air, that Bersani invents that phrase out of a reading of Simon Watney's book, that first study of representations of AIDS that I mentioned. And one of the things that Watney notices about the way gay men were appearing in news press in the 80s is that they were in the same kinds of positions, same similar length being used, that was used to refer to female prostitutes during the syphilis outbreaks at the end of the 19th century in London and in Paris. In both cases, there were tacit references to a kind of insatiable sexuality. Women can sort of sustain multiple orgasms much more than men can, right? And there are actually, Degas has drawings, you've seen them, yeah, that are of women that are supposedly from inside brothels that he drew, of women with little legs in the missionary position, splayed out in all sorts of ways. So there, almost I see more of a non-refusal. Hard, to map the moment in Bersani's phrase where the refusal comes in, but no doubt it's there.
Because he's also kind of just refusing the category of the homosexual, right? He's thinking of the kind of notion of a gay male subject that would dispense with the notion of and kind of turn it into more like a homo-ness or
Right,
something,
right, but through
Yes,
like a
right.
major embrace of like
Totally.
the most sort of homophobic caricature. There, yeah.
Right.
But what was your, I mean, in your question you mentioned intentionality as well. Intentions,
I
how
was
is that?
just off of the Gauman quote, which equated dance to a type of absence of or gesture rather, to this absence of intention, which refusal is a kind of maybe an excess of intention. You're really resisting, you're refusing, whatever. So I just into the kind of passivity, refusal, not reconcilable with powerlessness necessarily.
The aptitude is there in that other quote, because it's the inability to refuse.
Right.
So it's an aptitude refuse.
Mm.
It's not I can refuse, it's that I can't refuse. Right? All is about, this powerlessness is always about the powerless that is not of a subject.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is not a subject that
Has a quality,
whatever, like
right.
willfully being powerless.
Mm.
Powerlessness means there's no subject.
Mm.
Right? And so you can't refuse. It's the inaptitude of being a subject.
Yeah, so similarly for me, I'm trying to think about this question of refusal. So like what I'm trying to argue in my mission is this idea of disconsent to things. I'm trying to juxtapose the two terms to think about, like, instead of just this like yes means yes, no means no, this very clearly delivered message, like what are the other possibilities that we can sort of adopt to thought sexuality, but also reproductive futurity. I think refuse again. I think going back to what Colin was saying about intentionality, it's strongly associated with an intention, and this is something I'm trying to read in my work of how I intend or agree into things that we might not end up liking or end up desiring. A lot of assumptions about the linearity of time and this, like, I think in terms of revolution, like this progressive futurity, tomorrow is always better, but to maybe think otherwise. So I think that's how I'm trying to like sort of rethink feminist refusal in my work.
If I can add another comment maybe to this conversation, like for me, like understanding refusal as no intentionalities, like as meaning like no subject at all, is problematic, and that is also what is problematic in Agamben's in Potentiality, because if there's no subject, then there's no body, there's no, it comes with a lot of like problems, and like what if we can keep intentionality, but like as Agamben is suggesting, also like because there's no ends, there's no means, there's no arrival. I think that's what we probably need to remove in order to remove utilitarianism, this kind of like capitalistic logic driven toward only like actualization of and profits. For me, it's like intentional may not be a problem, but like more the actualization. What is the problem? The lack of the subject and a body that comes with it, and maybe like keeping the intention, but removing a fixed action that realizes it in a unilateral way is my way to navigate this. Any other comment or questions?
I mean, it seems to me along the lines of these questions, like, is it not even more than the way that the malleability of the body or is trued, or the language of choice that is, wrapped around it, that is the kind of real site of the ease with which that paradigm gets, because it already, even more than an intention, it is fully ensconced in the kind of language of willing and decision, which of course there have been, plenty of deconstructions of the look of decision and critiques of that logic that may or may not have to do with decision, but in the field of the political, like when that's the impasse at some point, like it's maybe why sexuality can't be political, because at some point you may not decide to do something, but one has to ultimately do something in politics or articulate something. So, I mean, is it really actually is the impasse here about the language of decision and the role it would ultimately in actually articulating a political position or a political effect more than anything, like, and the entanglement of the idea of willing and decision in a decisive or legal sense that always is going to call the subject back into the room in a very particular work. Yeah, I guess that's like even more than the body on some level, like what constantly does away with the theory of, rights or decision that begin to play automatically to some extent when anybody, whether you're talking about, when you're talking about politics.
So a choice would be kind of tethering an intention. And that's the problem. Choice is what tethers an intention kind of to an end.
Well, to an end, but also to a decision or a position. Choice implies alternatives, right, that are exclusive to some extent, arguably. I mean, we could play around with that, but in the kind of level of discourse or focus that maintain in politics, let's say, choice gets bound up in alternatives and in discourse and in all of these other trappings that kind of bring in language and will and rights, to do this or that. So I wonder if politics in general, or the kind of horizon of politics, is not a complicating factor here, along with the kind of, long and indeed very material, relationally, very lived experience or social rapport that arises from the history of liberal humanism and its conception of the subject, like that the subject is always trailing along the discourse of choice that implies somebody who is capable of making a distinction and a choice and a decision between alternatives, where one becomes final in some fashion, or an end or goal. That kind of puts the brake on the relational kind of realities and porosities, you know, of everything in play here with the body.
Yeah, that's interesting. Reminds me again of the inability to refuse in the phrase.
Yeah, I think there's the political recognition of the body that's really important. So think about like the population control policy in China, sort of this history. Thank you. This history of how how like womanhood is politically recognized is really subject to discourse globally, like this trans-Pacific articulation of the body of women's body, specifically in China, of how it's being recognized as racialized, as unwanted, and even now, so like whether to fund UNFPA has always been like a political issue between the parties in the U.S. So when Trump was elected the first time around, he defunded UNFPA because of pro-life activists were seeing them seeing China's contraception and so on as a human rights violation. But then when Biden got elected, funded the UNFPA. So now they're, I think in Project 2025, there's like one page where they're like, oh, we must stop this because of how this whole thing is being recognized, right, to provide women with contraception and the option to abortion is seen as a human rights violation. So I think that really speaks to what you're saying. Thank you.
If there are any more comments, we want you again for this very fruitful discussion. There are refreshments in the other room, and the next session is, if I remember correctly, on the 28th of March. So we hope to see you there. Here, yes, at the center.